I suck at role-playing NPCs. That's it, roll the credits. Too many people talk about their best tips for doing NPCs, and I think not enough people talk about how it feels to be an NPC. I really need to feel immersed into being that NPC way before my players even meet them. Usually what a lot of people will do is they will create a vast NPC backstory and try to have as much information as possible on hand. I used to make these cards for every NPC that I thought the players will meet more than once. They're very detailed, they have backstories, quirks, secrets, desires. I thought if I know everything about an NPC, I'll figure them out. I will find a way to jump back into role-playing these NPCs. But this is a fundamental misunderstanding of how humans imagine, well, other humans. We will be a bit philosophical here, so bear with me, please. The first ingredient to understanding NPC consistency is to understand your own visualization. Officially, 3.9% of people, according to this white paper, have aphantasia, or the inability to visualize pictures. But I don't think it's that black and white of a thing. This is a spectrum, so I would say this number is more around 10%. Where, 10% of people really struggle to visualize something. Everyone else struggles a bit in a way, but it's very rare to have perfect imagination of visualizing things in your head. So with that in mind, say you feel intimately acquainted with someone, a character or someone from your life. You can imagine them, but it doesn't mean you're actually picturing them as a whole. We take some elements of their looks that we remember, some preconceived notions, biases, elements from our subconscious, and with those things, we create a blurry collage in our minds. You can still somewhat focus on a detail and it becomes more clear, but the overall picture is kind of a mess. And when you have a low throughput medium like literacy, books, or tabletop, you cannot afford to go into every detail and define everything about how someone looks. At some point, you will get diminishing returns, as your brain can't form such a detailed image with everything else going around in the game or the book. You will see this in literature all the time. Characters are somewhat physically vague. They're described more by their behavior, their quirks. Any description that you give to a character basically helps create a boundary that's defining that character, but these features don't help us fully picture a person. You might say for someone middle-aged, short hair, strong build with a woodworker's axe, and that would be enough to already form a certain picture in your head rather than explaining what this person isn't. I mean, our brains are made this way, they're made to fill in the gaps. And the cool thing here is that this principle goes both ways, and that is where we come to the first tip of the day. So, someone's looks can give us an idea of how they would act. I know, it's a bias that we form while interacting with people around the world, and even though it can be wrong, it's deeply rooted in our brains. So for this technique, I'm aware that it might not work for everyone, but when I'm creating NPCs, it is crucial for me. I need a visual aid, so I need a picture that I will look at and wake up this bias inside me. And it doesn't have to be a full body picture that completely describes your NPC that you've imagined. I would go to Google, just find some images, and I would search for the face that reminds me of this NPC. And I might add to this picture just a couple of details, maybe some objects that this NPC fidgets around with, just elements that associate me with how that NPC would look and behave. I would just download some pictures and put them together in the same folder or just fuse them together in Paint. And I don't show these to the players because they might associate those images with a different archetype of behavior than I do. And that would create a dissonance between what I imagine and what they imagine. But I will describe them, and I keep my descriptions very short. I usually describe just the most defining characteristics, like short, middle-aged, gnome, plate armor, missing an arm, etc. That sort of thing. Just, of course, I would put it in a more meaningful sentence, but that's the gist of it. These ideas, or at least some of them, originate from this book that I'm reading right now. It is called What Do We See When We Read? And there is a line in here that I really like. In music, notes and chords define the ideas, but so do the rests. Okay, staying with this idea of being vague, can we find the least amount of information needed to trick our GM brain into falling back into the character, and for that to be enough that the players recognize which character it is. I think this has been perfected by voice actors. There is a trick from voice acting, although I couldn't find almost anything about it online, but I heard about it. Trigger phrases or activation phrases. This means there is a word or a sentence that is specific to this character, like a catchphrase or something that you know how to say in their accent, or something that's tied to their behavior. Basically something that they would say in a specific way that gets you back into the character. I think I have an example. There was this NPC that my players really liked and that had a catchphrase, "Don't cause any problems, don't mess with my tavern." And whenever I said this in my own language, I would immediately visualize that NPC. I would feel like I'm becoming that NPC. I wasn't successful in finding tips on this, but I will put some voice acting resources in the description so you can go into the rabbit hole yourselves. So this phrase can be as long as you want. It's something that when you feel you're losing the NPC, you can repeat and you're back at it again. And because of that property of trigger phrases, I really think that catchphrases are your friend here. I also had this one interrogator person that used some questionable techniques to get information out of the players. He became a follower of one of our players later on, but whenever this interrogator would talk to a new person, he would say, "What a lovely specimen, lovely." It really brings so much implicit meaning to who this character is, and I can immediately picture him in my mind. I would extend this idea further. As we mentioned, most authors and GMs willingly or unwillingly provide their fictional characters with much more behavioral descriptions than physical descriptions. So the next technique I would use is so-called trigger movements. Trigger movements are basically trigger phrases but for the body. When you're talking to a detective that is smoking a cigarette in a noir setting, you can take a pencil and pretend it's a cigarette. If you don't see your players, or if you're blind, you can just close your eyes or wear glasses. I think it really matters if you're sitting down or standing up. If you have players going into a room where the king is looking through the window, you want to stand up and put your arms behind your back. Or, you can sit down, but just make sure your arms are where the king would have them. I don't have a list of these movements, but there are some that really remind me of some NPCs. So the interrogator guy, for example, he would be pulling his fingers like this. So now imagine combining that with that phrase of, "What a lovely specimen." Yes, very lovely. And with the description that he has a bit of a hunchback and is bald. Yeah, you get the idea. I also have this rat folk that would be very erratic and would just move their fingers like this very fast, stutter a bit, do things with their body and head like this. And their trigger phrase is, "This is totally unfair, totally unfair." And now you see this erratic little rat folk person, and it's easier for me to repeat that when my players meet them again. The only thing that I need to remember is to move my little fingers and say, "This is totally unfair," multiple times, and I will be back into the character. I think I might have mentioned age a couple of times here, and you might say, okay, but how do I roleplay someone who is really old in human years, but young for their race? Well, I don't really know how you roleplay someone who has lived for 1,000 years, but if you translate that race's age into what it would be in human terms, even though a dwarf is, 50 years old, you don't give a description of, "Oh, this is a dwarf that's 50 years old," because to someone that sounds like a middle-aged man. No, you would just say, "It seems like a very young dwarf," and when they talk to the dwarf, he might tell them his real age. But real age is one thing and your description of their appearance is another. So these little things create distinction, and I think this distinction is important because when you look at tabletop RPGs, you might consider them closer to theater than they are to reading, but I don't think that holds true when you think about visualizing. So in a play, for example, you can have a couple of characters played by different actors, and new characters can be introduced and played by the same actors. It's even possible to have a single role that's being filled by multiple actors at different times. And we are okay with this, we subvert our disbelief. But when it comes to reading a novel, I think the same happens when we are playing TTRPGs. We visualize each character as being a distinct person, played by one actor. So to bridge this dissonance, I do the same thing that helps in theaters, and with that we come to the tip number 4. Use small props. As I already mentioned, the cigar, unsheath a sword if you're angry, or have a couple of coins that your character might be fidgeting with all the time. And as NPCs come, you take out these props and you combine them with the rest of the things on the list, visual aids, the trigger phrases, trigger movements, and you're surely going to make an NPC that stands out. Now, I wouldn't use this for one-off NPCs. I mean, I would if I had like time to prepare or visualize or come up with something on the spot. I would usually just use it for NPCs I know are going to be repeated in the campaign. And with all of this, you don't even have to use a very different voice or an accent. As I said, it's very hard for us to use the accents that are commonly known in the pop culture, because 99% of pop culture that we all consume here is in English, and we don't play in English. So all of these techniques are what we developed to make a distinction. And to answer your question, do I have a box of toys next to my table whenever we play? The answer is absolute yes. The final tip of the day, and I think this is very interesting. As a character develops through the course of your story, their appearance in the minds of your players and even your mind might change for multiple reasons. As a result of the vibe of the setting changing in your head, their inner development or their NPC character arc, or the players just start to adore or hate this character. And these things are what can shape how you and the players perceive and visualize an NPC. So when you introduce a character, that first introduction is an introduction of an incomplete character. And as you're interacting with this character, they might change their appearance, their demeanor might change, and this is completely normal. This happens with real people in real life too, so don't be afraid to revisit your NPCs after a couple of sessions, revisit their triggers, their poses, your visual aids, and maybe slightly change them. And this new character, the new version of them, reflects their growth and their change through the story. I mean, we're all people. NPCs are people, allegedly, and people change. So I think this is very cool to do from time to time, and it will look like you had it all planned in advance. I use all of these things, and I don't even prep NPCs that much. I write these 2-3 things and improv the rest on the fly. On that note, if you want to know more about improvising one-shots, I do have a video that I will link somewhere here. And please, leave a comment with your own ideas how to be consistent in role-playing NPCs. And if you want to support this channel, make sure that you create an NPC whose trigger movement is tapping the subscribe button below, please. I really recommend this book to everyone, and more from it is coming in the following videos. Of course, big thank you to the lovely people supporting me on Patreon. I'll make sure to have a PDF summarizing everything that I went through in this video on Patreon in the following days. I hope we'll bump into each other again somewhere in the vast and strange lands of the interwebs. But until then, I bid you
farewell, keepers.